World leaders have recently met at COP26 in Glasgow, where they committed to accelerate the transition to zero-emission vehicles so that we can meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Road transport accounts for more than 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and we know that total emissions are even growing faster than any other sector. Therefore, decarbonizing it is critical if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. The good news is that speeding up the adoption of electric vehicles is underway. It's a key element in the Green Deals of many countries around the world. This will offer huge opportunities for jobs and growth, not to mention cleaner air, improved public health, and supporting a transition to a cleaner power system. To discuss this transition and the hurdles and opportunities it represents, we have invited to our Urban Café today an incredible lineup of speakers. We have Luc Tschumper, the Deputy Managing Director at Swiss eMobility, where he is responsible for electrified fleets and charging infrastructure for businesses and real estate. We also have Professor Dr Schuh from RWTH Aachen University in Germany, where he focuses on disruptive innovations and information and production management, as well as sustainable mobility solutions. And last but not least, our very own Birgit Dargel at Siemens Smart Infrastructure, where she drives the implementation of the latest e-mobility technologies for customers ranging from individuals to depot and enterprise charging. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time, and welcome to the Urban Cafe. I hope you have a freshly brewed cup of coffee with you, and let's get right into it. Is the future of mobility electric?
I think the switch is very fundamental, and it will cover 90% of all mobility as soon as possible. The rest 10% will have alternative sources, energy sources, because that is for heavy duty traffic, for trucks and some special applications. But cars and passenger cars have to change into battery electrical vehicles.
Birgit, what does an optimal e-charging network look like?
I believe we need a network of fast and slow charging, especially fast charging for business travelers, ride-hailing services, service fleets, to take away the fear of those drivers that they can get out of energy when on the road.
Luc, let me turn to you. How does this apply to Switzerland? Do you see the space evolving rapidly?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Birgit. Charging isn't refueling, so it's not just going to be fast charger at petrol stations. It can be done wherever there is a parking space and a power outlet. That also makes sense from an energy grid perspective, because EVs are a rolling short-term storage unit. Through smart management, they're already able to charge when there's abundant energy, and they will also be able to give back via bidirectional charging in the future. So plugging your car whenever it's parked makes sense from a usability standpoint for the customers, but also for the power grid.
And maybe let's stay with you for a second, Luc. So if we imagine, if we jump 5 years or a decade from now into a world where EVs have been widely adopted, how will that scenario be different from the one we see today?
Well, it will for sure make our transport greener, healthier, and cheaper also. But EVs will also be a part of the solution into our transition into renewables. The EV revolution will, however, look different in different parts of the world. We already have seen this in the past. In Switzerland, it started with our e-bikes. We have a huge electrification scene there in our e-bikes. In the Asia-Pacific regions, it's e-scooters. In China, we're seeing huge bus fleets, or also cheap mini cars that can only go 45 kilometers an hour. So yes, in Europe, I think we'll see already big part of new car sales electric. But what I'm pretty interested in is to see what the dropping cost of EVs mean in other parts of the world, where also solar and wind power is abundant and cheap.
Günther, could you weigh in on that as well? What could that vision of the future look like to you?
I think Additionally, we have to kind of aggregate the transportation task in terms of ride sharing, in terms of bundling traffic demand. And at least we even need a new definition of individual mobility. Nowadays, we just call it individual mobility if I drive with my car from here to there and park it there. And I think inner city mobility can also be individual mobility if you're just picked up there where you are in that very moment on demand, not according to a bus schedule, and being transported but bundled in shuttles, in minibuses. And that will be a high utilization of cars, because we need to transport even more people in cities than today, but with less vehicles, and that means utilization of vehicles needs to be far higher, and we call it street transportation productivity. That can be increased by factor 10, but it requires that you can operate these shuttles or group taxis or minibuses more or less not 24/7, but 23/7. And that again requires that you are capable within that, that 1 hour between 24 and 23, that you are able to operate 23 hours, and in between these 1 hour is enough to refuel, to recharge these vehicles. And that will combine less emission and less traffic with higher transportation volume.
The idea here is really to focus on the usability of all these different modes of transport that we see around us. Do you see that happening already? It seems we are already starting to do that, right?
It happens, but not fast enough. And we have not enough capacity. We need charging stations, high speed, high capacity charging stations in a sort of overcapacity. We are now seeing that the technology is there with 400 volt, with 800 volt, with 1000 volt, and DC up to more than 300 kilowatt. However, we are afraid that when I'm getting there, that the station is occupied. So that infrastructure has to be there, and we shouldn't plan it as utilizing it to the max, because the main criteria is being available with that capacity.
That's what we've seen in Switzerland at the moment. We have an oversized grid, and I think it's very important. And at the moment, we can build as many fast chargers as we want. It's not going to be too much, but utilization is going to be low. But in the countries, I think it's very important that in the countries where we can afford to have an oversized grid, it's not possible everywhere around the world, but we in Switzerland and Germany or in Europe, in many places in Europe, have the funds and capacities to do that, so we should do it. And I think there's another aspect to it. If you have a lot of fast chargers, you can also charge the energy when there's abundant and cheap solar energy, which will help a lot, because those 23 hours that Dr. Günther talked about, this hour where the car charges doesn't have to be in the night. It can be during the day when you have solar.
Even so, we have grid capacity enough at certain points. We don't have it there where we need it. That's a very important topic, that the planning of such a kind of infrastructure needs to be done, properly done, and needs to be fast.
It seems that it's an undisputed fact nowadays that in the future EVs will be the most economic choice, but that we need innovation from different areas, whether industry or research, coupled with perhaps government subsidies, so that the sector can evolve. Now, what can be done to gather momentum?
So the first thing I think that should be done, besides the government support of purchasing EV cars, which are more expensive for the time being than traditional cars, is I would call any company with a couple of employees, especially companies with kind of headquarters or locations in a city, they should have, and that's in a way not public charging capacity or capability, it's company private owned capacity. So any company that is not providing enough charging capability for their employees is not a modern company anymore.
Companies play a very important role, but not only on the charging infrastructure side, but also on the fleet side, because companies, in opposite to private persons, think in total cost of ownership and not just buying prices. So they switched to EVs a bit faster than private people because of costs, and this will drive fleet electrification in the coming years.
Birgit, what is the Siemens perspective on this?
Yeah, I think once I mentioned already, it's that the governmental framework is supportive or should be supportive in this decision making, where to install the infrastructure so that it can be done fast and with affordable prices. The other thing, it's of course important that enterprises are becoming a role model. So that means that enterprises should switch from their traditional conventional cars to EV fleets, and this will be an important factor for the decarbonization. So here, for example, Siemens aims to be carbon neutral fleet by 2030. And we see it more and more that's also for the young generation to attract talents. It's a point when they ask, what are you doing for sustainability? So this is a game changer here as well.
Great. And we talked about some of the hurdles. I know, Gunther, you mentioned sort of the perception, right, and the behavior change. But I think a lot of people still cite the initial investment, the cost of buying an e-car as one of the main hurdles.
The whole market is not yet there. People are really afraid about various things. And now we see all that political willingness, and we see the OEMs providing a huge fleet, and that is increasing. And so the offer is there and the political willingness is there, but the customer isn't there. The customer, and what we need as a ramp up is far more than the willingness of customers. So we should really listen closely what customers fear and arguments are. And it's not mainly or only costs. Mainly people don't believe that the situation as such is mature enough. That is one part, of course, like we discussed, charging, but it's also the car. What is the residual value of a car? And then it's what Luc said, it's the entry barrier of investing for private people. So we have to cut one by one of these hurdles down.
Great, thank you. Fascinating. And Luc, what are the hurdles, do you think, for Swiss people, for example? I mean, you know, it's a very good quality of living. We're in a very affluent environment here. What is stopping people from adopting this, you know, at higher levels?
Well, less and less. At the moment, every fifth car sold in Switzerland is already electric, without any subsidies. So I think if we had subsidies like we have in Germany, it would probably have. At the moment, what is stopping people is actually the access to charging infrastructure. That's what we see. The first people who bought EVs in Switzerland, which was a Tesla countries in the last 10 years ago, were people who own a home, so who therefore have easy access to a charging infrastructure. By now, when it's entering mass market, we see that more and more people who rent want to buy EVs, and they don't have a right to install a charging infrastructure. So that's a big hurdle. I
would underline the experience topic, because I must also admit I was driving for a long time a combustion engine, and I was very much afraid to getting stuck somewhere without energy and having no station around me for charging. And then with, let's say, starting to rent a car, to try it over a weekend and to try it also long distance, it becomes fun.
That I think a very important factor that we that our colleagues in Norway are telling us about is the neighbor effect. So you do not necessarily have to experience yourself it can be sufficient if a good friend of you or someone in your family has this experience. And that's also why technology disruption seems so fast sometimes, because it only takes one person to convince 10 other people in their network. That's a big effect that we're starting to see in Switzerland also, now that we have those very attractive products who really work in daily use. You always need a combination of sticks and carrots. That's the most efficient way, and that's what we unfortunately also see in a lot of regions. I mean, you can be for or against it, but from an industry standpoint, it could make sense to communicate a ban of gasoline engines, even if it's far away in the futures, just to give planning securities to all the actors. But governments are very hesitant to do that. Not Norway. Norway, they have done it.
Birgit, something you talked about earlier, the range anxiety, and you also thought a lot about that. So it still is the fear, right, that your car has insufficient range to get you where you need to go and that you might get stranded. Do you see this as still one of the major barriers, to large-scale adoption of EVs?
So yes, it is a topic. When I talk to business travelers or to ride-hailing services or operators who are providing services and have service fleets, they all talk about it. And also, I mean, also the individual drivers, they have a certain fear that they get stranded on the way to their beloved ones. So a boost of charging network will really make a big change, that people think about much faster to switch from combustion engine to electrical vehicles. And we see it here now, also the programs from the government, like in Germany, they will now set up 1,000 high power charging parks in the next 2 years. And this, of course, will give a lot more confidence for the drivers in Germany, but also in other countries. Such programs are now starting to take off. Like in the US, they have set up their new infrastructure plan, which is also a combination of EV charging points and other topics. And also other smaller countries where, honestly, I have never thought about before, but countries with long distance travel, it's on the normal way. So like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they all start to set up their charging infrastructure to get more people confident that they can drive the electric vehicles, and electric vehicles are becoming much more popular also in those countries.
The problem, if I may add, the problem in terms of market is the southern part of Europe and a lot areas which, with like Luc said, like with little purchasing power. I was with my team 2 weeks ago in Thailand, and they're talking very much about EV cars, but there's nothing. And as Luc and Birgit said before, if people do not have a home where they can charge and there is no infrastructure, you can be as convinced as you want, you can't buy an EV car.
Maybe moving on from charging infrastructure and the availability of that to also how fast it takes to charge your car. So maybe, Birgit, could we talk about that a little bit? How can we speed up the charging process?
I mean, I personally was surprised, even though I'm dealing with it, but with own experience with own electrical cars, you get a different feeling for that. If you're on the road and on long distance travel and you make a stop over, so within 10-15 minutes, so it takes you not much more than a coffee or tea break to get your car charged up for the next 200 or 300 kilometers. So 30 minutes, 40 minutes until it's completely fully charged. So it depends, of course, on the battery of the cars, but with an extension of the charging network and with all the new cars are now planned from the OEMs, I think it's not a big hurdle anymore that you get your car charged in very short times.
I think we've come to the end of our discussion. Before we conclude, I'd just like each one of you to give me one final thought for us to take away with us. So perhaps, Günther, we start with you.
My wish is that we would, with everything we can, should invest in far more renewable energy. In the next 20 years, we cannot have too much of that energy supply.
Great. And Luc?
Yes, I think electric mobility is the low-hanging fruit to reduce our European emissions. So I think we should decarbonize our fleets quickly, not just for emissions' sakes, but also to accelerate the technology development and to drive down costs.
E-mobility ecosystem, it's really an important pillar for the decarbonization and to limit the global warming. And it's just much more than EVs and charging infrastructure. And it needs really all of us to contribute, from the government and politicians, with the frameworks, with the enterprises, bringing the technology and innovation and being also a role model, until each individual who can contribute with his own mobility act, I would call it.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining the Urban Café. It was a pleasure to have this discussion, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.